Hello, I'm Kieran, a MajorTim.space honorary ambassador, and this is Oliver Ukereghe and MajorTim.space young ambassador. Today we are honoured to be interviewing Chris Packham, a renowned naturalist, nature photographer, television presenter and author. Chris, would you mind introducing yourself?
Oh, hello everyone. Yes, I've been interested in wildlife since I was very young, and that was a very long time ago. I'm 63 years old now, and that lifelong fascination for everything that creeps, claws, slithers and slimes has been retained throughout my life. I qualified as a zoologist in the 1980s, but soon I found myself broadcasting for the BBC, initially making a children's wildlife program called The Really Wild Show, where we took quite complex scientific uh, aspects of ecology, physiology, behavior, and broke them down so that they were comprehensible to young people. Today, I probably spend as much of my time campaigning as I do broadcasting, as it won't have escaped any of your notice that we are in quite serious trouble when it comes to our climate and our biodiversity. Nevertheless, I remain very hopeful that we can, certainly given the energies of younger generations like yourselves, turn this around. And although we'll live in a much changed world, it won't necessarily be a bad one.
That's awesome. I'd just like to start by asking you how you began your career and if you always knew that you wanted to work in nature conservation.
No, when I was a child, it was always about the animals as it was initially, and then obviously plants and fungi. I was fascinating. I just wanted to know everything about every species that I encountered and all of those in my encyclopedias, and I was driven by that quest for knowledge. This was in the 1960s and 70s, and our broader understanding of the need to conserve animals was there, but it wasn't as well developed as it is today. So it was only really not until I got to about 13 years old that I realized that as well as being beautiful and interesting and a boundless source of knowledge, then the natural world needed looking after. And so I then decided that I wanted to stay in the academic system and study particularly birds, but it could have been anything really. I ended up studying badgers, and I worked towards that. And that obviously saw me working through my GCSEs, A-levels and undergraduate degree. And it was only at that point that I decided that I would essentially, I suppose, change my mind. I'd recognized that I didn't really have the sort of mental disposition to be doing that. And I left and I started taking photographs of wildlife. And in order to pay for that, I started work as a camera assistant. And in periods of unemployment, I found myself with an opportunity to start broadcasting. So in answer to your question, it was never on my agenda. As a child, I didn't watch much TV. I preferred it in its nature raw in tooth and claw. I preferred meeting it firsthand outside. So no, it wasn't something that I aspired to. It was something I very much drifted into.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So, when you're at home, how do you personally help wildlife?
So when I'm at home, I'm fortunate to have a relatively large garden. When I inherited that, when I bought the house, it was not a great place for wildlife, and it really should have been. I worked really, really hard over the last 4 years to transform that space. I enjoy that physically. Yesterday I went out and I planted 400 plants in my garden. Prior to that, the day before, I planted 10 trees. It's a battle. Nature, I planted trees last year. We had an influx of a certain very exciting species of moth, and most of them got eaten, which was brilliant. That's exactly why I planted them. But I needed to do some more. Aside from that, I do what I can to increase awareness of the plight of that wildlife using social media and other media. I give quite a few interviews. I have one tomorrow morning at 8:30, where I will be standing up for wildlife in the face of a government that seems to think that bat tunnels are not important, and nor are newts. So advocacy is really important. And then I also spend quite a lot of time trying to get those of us who are interested in conserving wildlife to work more closely together, because I think we do have the power to make an enormous difference. But at the moment, very often, we're trying to do that in relative isolation, and we're not as effective as we could be. So that's what I spend. I like the practical aspect of literally doing things to my own patch and seeing the reward. I had a brilliant moment this afternoon. I was putting out some bird food, and therefore I was standing by the feeder, and a male sparrowhawk came in, thinking that it would not be myself, but a bunch of blue tits and great tits and chaffinches that would be attending the feeder. And it sort of flew round me in a very tight circle and then flew across the garden. And I mean, I cannot tell you how excited I was. It was just absolutely fantastic. Took my breath away, made my heart miss a beat. That's the sort of connection with nature that I always crave.
That's awesome. Now, I know you do like a lot of nature, although I've also noticed that you've openly talked about being diagnosed with autism. So are you actively involved in any campaigns to raise public awareness of the condition?
I am. I am. So I've just finished a two-part program for the BBC, which will be broadcast some point this spring, where we look at two other aspects of neurodiversity, dyslexia and ADHD. And rather like autism, in parts of our society, they are not very well understood. And I think that by having open conversations, as we do in the programs with people who have been diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD, we bring a greater awareness of those conditions, and therefore there's an opportunity for a much better understanding of that. I work as a patron for the National Autistic Society, and independently from that, I'm in contact with quite a large number of neurodiverse people. And I, like not last week, the week before, I went and gave a talk at a government body. I do corporate speaking as often as possible, trying to change that landscape and make sure that people understand, the difficulties we might face as for being neurodiverse, but also, and critically also, some of the strengths that we have and the abilities that we have. And I think that we have to nurture those, deal with the disabling aspects of it, and particularly when it comes to young people, we have to work very hard to make sure that they are able to utilize their strengths and that they are able to enjoy as rewarding as possible a life where they can be productive. And that means about getting employment. And we know a lot of neurodiverse people struggle with employment opportunities, and that's something that we have to continue to address.
Yeah, that's really cool.
In your opinion, what is the most important the UK government should be focusing on in regards to climate change and for world leaders so they can?
Yeah, I mean, look, we live in really critical times. I listen to the scientists. I like to make my opinions based upon the best information that I can get at that time. I like to make my decisions based on the best information I can get at any time. And for me, having grown up through a background in science, I turn to the scientist. I don't turn to TikTok. I don't turn to X, and I don't even turn to the BBC. And as a consequence of that, I read the science, and the science is telling us that we have to take some action. And, what we have to do is basically address climate breakdown and biodiversity loss. And we know full well that we've got to keep our fossil fuels in the ground. And so I want to see a government that's investing significantly in reducing fossil fuel dependency and developing, when it comes to energy, industries based around renewables. And so we have a government that's talking a lot about growth at the moment, which is philosophically a bit of a struggle, because we are just one planet and we can't continue to grow infinitely because we have a finite amount of resources. But what we should be doing, if we're looking at generating jobs, stimulating the economy, is looking at the renewables sector. And that means solar, it means wind, it means wave. And those opportunities have always been there. It's just that we haven't had governments that have been brave enough and bold enough to make those investments. And now, tragically, we're paying the price for that. And when it comes to biodiversity loss of our wildlife, you may know that we are one of the most nature depleted parts of the world. So as much as we love our wildlife, we describe ourselves as a nation of animal lovers, there's less in our backyard than there is in many, many other parts of the world. And we have to address things, therefore, like the way that we farm our landscape. And we know that we have to eat less meat. So a transition away from animal agriculture towards, providing food for people on plant-based diets is absolutely essential as well. And these are all things that can happen. In order to facilitate them, we need a couple of key ingredients. We need a tolerance of the fact that not everyone will want to start those transitions at the same time. So at this point, we have to be aware of that fact. And that means that equally, we have to be patient with each other. Not everyone can afford to take advantage of an opportunity to deal with a problem at the same time. Firstly, a tolerance, then some patience, and lastly, kindness. We need to implement kindness. What we don't need to do is be divisive and take sides and stick in the mud and refuse to change. It's clear that we've got to change. So let's use tolerance, patience, and kindness to make that transition as rapidly as possible. And that's what I believe our government should be stimulating at this point.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And now, this isn't a second question, although you mentioned about like solar and that. Do you think that's like the future of travel, like over fossil fuels? Do you think developed? Or?
Well, you will have heard of the COPs, and you will have heard perhaps of the Paris Agreement, and you may have heard of the UK's response to that in the form of a Climate Change Act. And we introduced a Climate Change Act in 2008 to deal with emissions, basically. And we've done really well when it comes to energy generation. So when it comes to producing the energy to power the lights in this room and the heating that you might have in yours, et cetera, we've done really well. We're scoring somewhere between like 40 and 70% success. And that's far ahead of many other places in the world. However, when it comes to addressing the emissions coming from farming, which are significant, we've only achieved a 4% success since 2008. And when it comes to transport, we've only achieved an 11% success. So we've done really well with energy, but we've done very, very badly with farming and transport. So it's clear where we've got to catch up. We need to start changing those farming policies. I've already mentioned the transition to a plant-based diet. And when it comes to transport, we need investment in transport systems where they're not as hungry to consume energy and they can be powered by those renewables. We need public service, but transport is basically what we need. And we've needed it for a long time.
Yeah. But yeah, so I mean, farming uses up like a lot of like resources and that. Although, do you think farming is better for the environment than importing like loads of like veg and that?
Well, we've got to support a farming industry in the UK. And some of those farmers and their families have been involved in farming for not hundreds, but maybe even thousands of years. And they want a secure future for them and their families. And I think it's really important that we make that a reality for them. And therefore, investing in our farmers and nurturing them through that transition is really important. So we need to start putting our money from our trouser pockets, purses and wallets into theirs, and not through great greedy supermarkets which restrict their ability to make profits, and also will import food from overseas, which they sell at a loss and which basically puts our farmers out of business. So I'm not speaking nationalistically here. There's not a nationalistic cell in my body, However, I do recognize that, importing lamb from New Zealand, which is halfway around the world, to undercut the industry that currently produces lamb in the UK seems to be absolutely balmy. So if I'm saying to those farmers, hey, we need to cut down on the amount of lamb that you're producing because basically it's bad for the environment, it's bad for biodiversity, I've got to bring them on board. And paying them properly for the produce that they have at the moment is certainly part of that. At the same time, we know that we have to make sure that our farmers are able to access public money to improve the way that they farm the landscape, so it is better for wildlife and people. And at the moment, they don't have access to that sorts of funding. And that's through poor governance. And we need to make sure that, as I said, we work very closely with the farmers to make these transitions. However, there are some aspects of the farming fraternity, notably some of their more vocal unions, who they don't want to change. They want to keep bad business as usual, and that's not protecting their members. That's heading to hell in a handcart. So it is difficult sometimes to win hearts and minds, and that's something we need to do. So what I would ask everyone listening is that, as I've already said, tolerance, patience, and kindness. Let's extend that to the farming fraternity, whilst at the same time forthrightly asking them to transition and change the way that they manage our landscape.
You've previously appeared on shows like The Chase, but would you ever consider following in the footsteps of Michaela Strachan and taking a part in shows like Dancing on Ice or Strictly Come Dancing yourself?
Well, no. I think that when you do those sorts of things, you've got to have some semblance of the skills required. So I went on The Chase because I have a relatively good general knowledge. I'm interested in everything and anything, and I've got pretty good memory. So I can be, a valid contestant. If I would be asked to dance or sing or cook, I don't have any of those skills in any meaningful form. So I think those TV programs work because someone has the basis of those skills and they develop it, and we can enjoy them doing so. So I've been watching Michaela on Dancing on Ice. It's remarkable. I mean, Michaela was a dancer. She's now a skater, and she's learned to skate, but she had those dancing skills to transfer into the skating part of it. And I think that's why she's proving to be so good at it and why she's so successful. I wouldn't have those dancing skills to even start with. So many years ago, an actor said in a film, and I remember this as a young person, he said, a man, but let's translate that to a contemporary context, a person has to know their limitations. And I always readily accept mine. I can't sing and I can't dance and I can't cook. So in short answer to your question, I'll leave that to Michaela.
Chris, since you resigned from your position at the RSPCA, have the charity taken any steps to address your concerns regarding animal welfare?
I don't believe that they've made the progress that I would like them to make. However, we have to accept that charities like the RSPCA are large, and it's very difficult for them to make, those transitions that I speak of rapidly. I think that what I wanted to see them doing was starting to make those transitions, and I would have exercised my tolerance, patience, and kindness, and I did for a long time, but I didn't see any real meaningful movement to deal with some of the crises that the charity was facing. However, I have to say and caveat that with the fact that the RSPCA is a remarkable charity, and every day its members, its volunteers and its staff get up and do an enormous amount of good work when it comes to animal welfare in the UK. Where I feel that they weren't focusing those endeavours forthrightly enough was when it came to farmed animals and the way that they were treated, and also leading, not following, but leading in that transition away from farming animals to that plant-based diet, which I believe is a necessary part of our solution when it comes to dealing with climate breakdown and biodiversity loss.
Yeah.
What has been the proudest moment of your career?
I don't have one. I'm a really ruthlessly self-critical person. So if you were to ask me about, sort of personal success in whatever way you might want to measure that success, I would really struggle to come up with something which I think that I'd had achieved. And I think the reason for that is that although sometimes I may almost get to, what I've been striving for, from my perspective, I can always see that I could have done better. So I suppose if I'm proud of something, it's probably that I'm not proud of anything. And that therefore means that I'll continue to strive to do better. And I think that that's the best people like me and anyone like myself can do. I just hope that throughout the course of my life, for me, the whole of life is a learning experience. It's not going to stop. It never was scheduled to stop. I'm happy to continue to know that I've got to learn more. That means I have to change my mind quite regularly. An issue being perhaps like with the RSPCA, and I have to see that as a strength. I also have to have the capacity to say I was wrong. I've made a mistake, and that's really important to me. So, keeping that sort of outlook for the whole of my life will be something that I might be terminally proud of. But let's see. Let's see. I think one problem is that if you perceive yourself as being successful in any way, shape, or form, not necessarily, but it may allow complacency or contentment to creep in. You may sort of think, well, I've done that now. I can sit back a bit and, oh, wasn't that jolly good? There's not much more to do. It's just not the case. I can't sit back, and there's so much more to do that I can't have any of that contentment or complacency. So I have to continue to be self-critical and work harder and harder and harder.
Yeah. Chris, would you consider rejoining the RSPCA as president if they were to take action on some of these important changes?
Of course I would, and that goes towards what I was just saying. I'm always happy. Firstly, I never bear grudges. Life is too short to carry a grudge. And then there's another couple of things that I don't do. I used to, actually, but I don't anymore. I used to hate things. And I think I used the word hate in its real context. I used to really, really dislike things. And I disliked them to the point that it was irrational. And I wasn't able to think clearly about things because I spent all of my time disliking them. And that's not a creative way of addressing an issue. And I think if you're angry, you have to come up with a creative means of solving the problem. There's no good just screaming and shouting and saying, I hate that, I refuse to engage with it. That doesn't work. It's not the way I behave. And so, it would be a dream come true for at some stage in the future, the RSPCA and myself, to be honest with you, to have moved into a space where we can get together again. And let's be clear, and I'll say it for the second time, the RSPCA does an enormous amount of good work for animals in the UK, and I have enormous respect for their staff. I just didn't think they were moving rapidly enough to address some of the really serious issues in farmed animal welfare.
Yeah. I have noticed you have made many references to reality TV shows, such as I'm a Celeb, Get Me Out of Here, on social media. Obviously, there are many issues on that show, like many environmental issues. However, what's the biggest one, in your opinion, out of the animal cruelty, the travel issues, etc.?
I think it's the lack of respect for life. Every single living thing wants to live. It wants to stay alive. It's its mission. We've got to grow until we're mature, and then we've got to reproduce ourselves in that population. That's fundamental biology. The second thing is that when it comes to a respect for life, that includes all life, every single living thing. So that's even all of those animals, which sometimes we find a nuisance. That might be mosquitoes, it might be wasps, it might be rats, mice, and pigeons. All of those animals play a vital role in the ecology of our planet, and they provide, therefore, sustainability and resilience. And I think that what aggrieves me most about programs like that is their disrespect for life. You know, they brutalize and reinforce stereotypes about animals which they presume people don't like, and that's because of lack of education. Things like, well, let's just group them together and say bugs. And some of the things they do to bugs, they wouldn't do to kittens and puppies. And for me, that's just completely,
Yeah.
wrong. You can't score life. You can't say kittens are more important than beetles. It's just nonsense. They're both important, and we shouldn't show disrespect to either. So I think it's that, yeah, it's a lack of respect for life. And I spend all my time when it comes to broadcasting for getting people to love life, everything, love it all, because it's interesting, it's fascinating, and we need it for a functional planet. And they spend their time trying to get people to dislike life and disrespect it, and that makes me pretty cross.
Yeah, I get that. That's a very good point. Now, a question that I've been really waiting to ask you is: many of the products we use, such as like women's makeup, regular skincare products, medicine, most of it's tested on animals. How do you feel about like animal testing in the UK?
I've long supported organisations which have been lobbying for and investing in a transition away from needing to test on animals. And this is 2025, and we've come a long way in terms of our technology and the way that we use that technology. And I'm glad to say that in many instances, animals are no longer being used in tests because we found real alternatives. Tragically, many animals are still used in testing. And as a consequence of that, I continue to campaign alongside some of the charities, Humane Society International might be one, and also to support companies who have a zero tolerance policy when it comes to animal testing, like Lush. And you mentioned cosmetics, and I have a keen association with Lush, but I'm not being paid to advertise them. But I can tell you that their products are vegan in the main, and they certainly, none of them are tested on animals. So there are alternatives there, and I think that the pound in our pocket is a very powerful tool. So if you have concerns about animal testing, make sure that you find those products, no matter what they are, not necessarily cosmetics that Lush sell, but other things too, and you don't buy them. And eventually that will make sure those people change their practices.
Yeah. Well, Chris, it's been an absolute honour interviewing you this evening. Just to finish off our interview, I'd like to ask you if you have any advice for young people wishing to pursue the career in like nature conservation and in campaigning against environmental issues.
Yeah, I guess I do. And that is, you're important. In fact, you're more important than I am because you're younger than I am. And I've been fortunate to have enjoyed a period of relative stability and health when it comes to the natural environment, and that's now seriously imperiled. Uh, I get really fed up with people of my age and maybe marginally younger saying, we listen to young people. And it's so patronizing because they may well listen, but they never act upon young people's wishes, advice, or direction. And I'm very much a believer of the fact that young people speak with clarity. They are unencumbered by some of the problems that older people have in terms of their political affiliations. And when I say political, I'm not talking about political parties. I'm talking about within the structure of their life. So they're clear thinking, they're clear speaking, and critically, young people are a lot less risk averse than older people. And this is a time where we need bold and brave action. And sometimes that means taking risks. And I like the fact that young people take risks. So my advice was, know that you are important. Every single last one of you is important. All of your voices matter. Make sure those voices are not only heard, but they are acted upon. It's time for you to stand up, to be counted, and to shout above the ghastly noise that my generation and others have left you trying to find space in. So please know that there are some of us who are very keen to invest in youth, support youth, hand over the reins to youth, and delegate youth to proper decision-making opportunities. Find those opportunities and act. That would be my advice.
Yeah, thank you. It's been so nice having you here today. It's been an honour. You've had some fantastic responses. And thank you so much for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure, and good luck to every single one of you. And continue to remember, continue to work hard, think straight, and speak loudly.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.